So welcome back to Study Chess with me. And in this particular session, we're going to be looking at the endgame. Since I've been returning to chess study and, let's say, bridged my hiatus, I've shown videos only on tactics and the middle game. And not because I've been hiding my endgame study, but because I haven't actually gotten back to it. So this is that return. Now, the work I've been focusing on is Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. And it holds a lot of key positions, but it's also very difficult work. And to put that in perspective, very briefly, I wondered whether my success rate was normal or failure rates, really, to put it that way. Because when I began studying, I only got through a chapter and a half, to be honest, the pawn endgames and some more. I was succeeding in, I believe, 3 out of 8 or maybe 3 out of 10 exercises that he gave you. Others, I found a lot of material, but really did not succeed in solving them. And only 3 I could consider I really solved. But they were hard, really, really hard. And I began to wonder whether this was me or just something about the book. So I consulted a few grandmaster friends, asking them about the book without asking them to give me any hints or details or anything like that, because that would be kind of disrespectful, in my opinion. And asked them what they thought of it. And they said, look, it's a brutally hard book. If you solve, let's say, one friend told me, if you've solved, let's say, 3 out of 10, that's not much worse than what I would do. So don't feel dismayed by having that much trouble. It's a really hard work. I think that Dvoretsky expects too much of his students. I thought, okay, fine. Another grandmaster told me pretty much the same thing. So yeah, the consensus is this is a really powerful work, very important, a lot of instructive material. But yes, it's not abnormal for you to, or me in any case, to be having so much difficulty solving really some of these exercises of his. I will nevertheless say, in all fairness, that even in the exercises that I failed and whatever, the solutions were many times really beautiful and matched some of the key precepts in the lessons that he gave in almost magical ways. So it's a real work of love. And I respect Dvoretsky enormously for that, regardless of this. And don't think of this as some kind of, I'm doing this to show you how little you know and how bad you are or anything like that. He loves it and he may not realize just how challenging it was. Nevertheless, another work that I am studying and that I will not be including in my videos other than a brief overview here, because I recently acquired it, is Mastering Endgame Strategy by Johan Hellsten. Now, Johan Hellsten is the author of also 2 other books with similar titles, The Opening and The Middle Game. This particular work is viewed very highly and well by the community, and I thought this would be a great addition. But it doesn't teach me directly key positions the way Dvoretsky does. So this would be a more how to approach the end game as a whole. And I think that's an important step to me to be able to progress. I'll be showing it briefly as I have my edition in Forward Chess, just to give you an overview so you can see what it's like. But I won't be really studying it in depth in videos to not disrespect the author, of course. And other than to say, great job, and hope others are able to engage in it as well. Now, all that being said, let's get to it. So this is already the book, Mastering Endgame Strategy. I'm on the chapter Opposition, but that's very early on in the work. And this is the edition of Forward Chess as viewed through their browser app. If you're using this on the phone, and you can, of course, or a tablet, you'll have a slightly different view. But in all cases, you'll basically have the text, as you can see here, and a resizable board. I've resized the board fairly small, but note that you can actually increase the board enormously. I resized it this way so that you can actually have a little bit of me and the board to have it more interactive as opposed to a quiet screen with a narrated voice over it. That said, I will give you a brief example as to what the work is like. I'll give you a look at the table of contents. And again, like I said, it's just to show you this is one of the works that I'm using to study the endgame. One of 2. One I will be sharing with you, which will be Dvoretsky, and you can see me breaking my face on a wall as I try to get through some of his stuff. And this work on the side. But this is basically for full disclosure and transparency. So we have the table of contents here, as you can see. Forward chess allows you to set it to different, let's say, views. I tend to watch this in dark mode. So basically, it'll be a very dark background, not black, but dark with a lighter text. And they also have a sepia. I left it like this basically for the video, but as a rule, I work with it in dark mode. So here you have the table of contents, as you can see, classical themes, queen themes, mates and perpetuals, centralization, series of checks, whatever, minor piece themes, and whatnot. This is all about strategy and how to employ the different methods inside of it. And although it will, of course, necessarily approach and lead you to many key positions, what they call essentials, like Dvoretsky, it doesn't necessarily go out of its way to cover all of them because it's not about teaching you all of these key positions. They just happen to be included out of necessity. Dvoretsky is where you want to go if you really want to know what all those key positions are and master them and memorize them to include in your overall, let's say, toolkit. Okay, so opposition. So opposition tends to be one of the first methods taught within pawn endings, and it is highly relevant to dominate it in practice. Let's start with a few simple examples. And here you have a little diagram that's really small. And the point is that if I click on it, well, actually, probably not. If I don't click on it, the interactive board is not visible. And if I click on it, suddenly the interactive board is. But there are multiple ways to access the interactive board, so it's not really a big deal. Up here at the top, you saw me click on it. Show hide board. If I do that, it'll work as well. So if I click here, same thing. And I can, like I said, resize the board so it fills the screen, which of course is how I usually use it anyway. So the key position here, and this is not meant to be an exercise, although of course we can approach it that way. King d4, gaining the opposition, our king isn't placed in front of its counterpart. Of course, king c4, king c6 is wrong when it is black who gains the opposition. King d4, king c6, he points out that after king e6, king c5, and of course it's an easy win. That's the kind of thing that Dvoretsky doesn't even bother showing. He probably thinks it's too obvious. Well, considering the expectations he has for his reader's skill, not too surprised. And as for a pawn sacrifice with a5, white should evidently avoid b takes a5, king c6, and of course, you can't do anything because the fact you have two pawns on the h file or even six, it won't matter if the king manages to get to the corner because you can never kick him out. So, of course, not b takes a5, but rather, and of course not king here because then pawn takes same problem. B5 is the only move. So going back to the position after a5, white wins. I skipped the text because I didn't find it necessary. It does mention that if the pawn was not on the a file, if it were on b or c, then you could probably take that pawn quite comfortably. I'm simply dealing with what he gave us here. So going back to the position after a5, white wins with b5. And if he uses his king accurately, for example, king c7, king c5, king b7, king d6, and not, he points out, king b6, because after b6, you would think, oh, not a problem. Now he's going to have to go back to b8, and I'll just show you here, sorry. b8, and then I'll bring my king here and grab the two pawns. No, because black will instead play king a6. And you have a little problem here, because if your king comes to c6, it's a stalemate. Oops. King c7, king e7, and you're gaining the opposition on the side. And eventually you're going to come in and he's going to be forced to allow you in. So let's say king b7, king d7, and what do you do? So let's say king b6. King c8. And then you have two problems. Yeah, you're not going to come back to d6 and have sit there going back and forth. Uh-uh. And here, basically, black has two moves. Black can come over to a7. So let's say king a7, and he has to says, user move. My video is covering it, but the app allows you to enter your own moves, which is kind of cool. So king b6 for here, king comes down, king here, and then we will grab those two pawns. So this is a quick overview to show you basically what um, the work by Johan Hellsten is like. And it's really nice. It's very complete. It's very thorough. It's fairly long, but of course, it's trying to cover all of the endgame themes or concepts as a rule. So yeah, it's going to have a lot of things. I read somewhere, and I would need to look it up because I haven't actually checked this myself, that there are upwards of 440 or 500 or I don't know how many exercises. Certainly more than Dvoretsky, but certainly easier. Easier doesn't mean easy. Doesn't mean he's giving it away because your opponents aren't going to give you the positions either. Not really. Nevertheless, this is where you want to be and the kind of work you want to be studying if you want to get to reach your goals, which I do. So now I'm going to go straight to Dvoretsky and let's see what we see. Okay, so to take this seriously, even though I've actually finished the chapter, or let's say the section of the chapter on pure opposition in Dvoretsky, but yeah, I think it's time for a refresher. So we have here the opposition. This is illustrative example 1.7, whatever that means. Not sure if that's an entry in the thing. No, it's entry number 13 in the database of the product. So that's not it either. Regardless, I do actually have, and you can't see it because I'm only showing you the board, the moves as well as the text and explanations. And of course, I'll be sharing that. So we have here black to move. White has the opposition, but it's not enough to win. Okay, so obviously we do have the opposition. Let me see if I can get these squares right. Yeah, okay. So obviously white does have the opposition. It's not going to be enough, however, and he's going to explain why. So the correct move for black, there's only one correct move. If you want to pause it, by all means, but I can't follow you because I have the answer right in front of me. But nevertheless, there will be exercises to actually resolve. So let's just go on with it. So the proper move is king c7. And king a7 is a mistake, which would actually lose. So let's see what happens if king a7 so that we can appreciate king c7. King a7 is a mistake in view of a5. Pawn takes, king takes, and now getting the opposition is decisive. And that's actually pretty easy to see. Okay, that's pretty basic. So good. We won't have to worry about racking our brains to try to remember some mind-bogglingly difficult position. The more interesting aspect is to realize that this position is a draw. And that should be known by both sides, and of course, how to draw it. So the proper move is king c7. And now things are different because c5 would be useless, he points out, because the king starts an outflanking maneuver. So first of all, king a6, king c6, king a7, king c7, king a8, king c8. Nice. It points out that king c6 would not work because now king b8 going around it, king c5, king b7, and now white is winning because of course black is stuck. So if we move the position one file to the right, white would win because now king d7 is met by d5. Okay. So it says king c5 would be useless. Because the king starts an outflanking maneuver. Okay, because yeah, I mean this is pretty basic. So of course c5 is useless for the very simple reason is that you take. And of course the king then is going to move over to a8. And as is well known, I mean this isn't exactly Dvoretsky Endgame Manual level knowledge you need to know. You cannot kick the king out of a8, and therefore the pawn will never promote. So yeah, so obviously c5 is not going to go anywhere. And for the same reason, he points out that in this particular case, while c5 doesn't work, if everything was shifted one to the side, to the right, therefore these pawns are here, if these pieces are here, and white is also moved to the side, then of course moving the pawn forward would work because there's no a8 that you can escape and block from. Simple enough. Okay. So this is a position by Herman Noy. It's the next in the lesson, and it dates from 1890, which tells you a lot about how thorough the great Dvoretsky is in terms of the resources and the sample positions that he has collected and chosen for the work. These are absolutely not coincidental. And he says the only thing that saves white is getting the distant opposition, because of course white is down a pawn and is in risk of simply losing. And what is that move? Like I said, feel free to pause it, but I can't try to solve it with you because I have the position, I have the solution right in front of me. I might be showing only the board, but I have the notation as well. And the move here is the very lovely King H1. And you have to admit that uh, Dvoretsky's choices aren't simply instructive, they do have a certain aesthetic appeal. So just this shows out that King H1, and now if King D2, King H2, King D3, King H3, maintaining the distant opposition. If instead of King D2 he were to try, let's say, um, King E1, then King G1, and we start doing the same thing. So King E2, King G2, etc. And finally, if G4, with the idea, of course, of taking, and then the D pawn comes down with a check, then the solution here is King G2. And now if King D2, F takes G4 is sufficient. There's no longer any check, and therefore it's going to draw. Okay. So what happens if you don't play King H1? It's worth looking at. And of course, Dvoretsky includes this. He says that if you were to instead try, let's say, King F1, why not this? White would like to take the opposition with King F1, but this is a mistake too, because after King D2, King F2, King D3, the F3 square, which is where the king would need to be able to maintain that opposition, is occupied by a pawn. And the opposition therefore passes to his opponent because after King G3, E3, King G2, King E2, etc., yeah, it's not going to change anything. So you just gave away the opposition because you had a pawn that was preventing you from maintaining it. Finally, if instead he plays King G3, big mistake, running for that black pawn, but it's not going to work because King E1. Nice. You'd think that, oh, run for that pawn with a King E2. No, that's not going to do it, right? Instead, the trick is King E1, King G2, King E2, King G3, King F1, and we go around. So what happens if we were to actually run for the pawn? Well, it's really simple. I'll show it to you all the same, even though it's not difficult to see. If you were to run for it, let's say with King E2, king g2. And suddenly you've got the opposition, the famed one that you were looking for. Yeah. That's why you can't run for it like king e2, because white isn't going to go up with king g4. Now we're going to come down and say, position, thank you. Okay, so anyway, next. Okay, so the next position in the lesson on opposition is a study now by Herman Madison from 1918. And it's white to play. White is obviously in trouble because black is threatening to pick up all those pawns, and there's nothing white can do to avoid it. So how is he going to save this position and not get killed by the opposition? Because distant king away, take those pawns away, black wins easy. Okay, so now let's examine the mechanism by which the stronger side can exploit the distant opposition. It is in fact quite simple and consists of the conversion of the distant opposition into close opposition by means of outflanking. If outflanking is not possible, the possession of the distant opposition is worthless. The pawns are lost, after which black's king will control the key squares in front of the f7 pawn. But white has a tactical resource at hand. He moves both pawns forward to lure black's pawn nearer to his king, allowing him to defend the new key squares. So let's see how he does that. G6, exclamation point. F takes G6, F5, another exclamation point, deserve it. G takes F5, King G1, draw. Well, it's equal in any case. Black controls the distant opposition, but he cannot convert it into the close opposition. The problem is this, is that after King G5, and he doesn't actually show this, he just describes it in the text, King F1, outflanking with King H4 has no advantage, has no point. Now, obviously, if you try to come to F4, it's opposition for white. So, for example, you come here, and unfortunately, King H4, he says, is useless. And that's actually true. That's pretty easy to see. And the simple reason is that I'll simply play King F2, diagonal opposition. And if you were to come to, let's say, King H3, of course, I just go up and pick up the pawn, and that's it. And if instead you were to try to go to King G4, then King G2 is a draw as well, because white has the opposition. So there's no outflanking to win this position. Okay. Let's see the next one. So next position in the opposition, and it is a study now by Jan Dvoretsky, 1907. And here we have a much more extensive solution, I'm telling you in advance. It is white to play, and white does win this. But it's a very narrow path to victory. A lot of the moves will lead to draws with considerable lines to explain why. So let's first look at what the main line is, and then we can explore why the other moves are hopeless. So he says the following. In such positions, there is usually a major line in which it is vitally important to capture the opposition. And when the enemy king retreats from it, you must outflank him. Now, in this instance, that would be the F file. So, F file. And you must outflank him. Imagine that black's king was on F7 and moved to one side. White must move to outflank. Thus, King G2. It is pointless to stay on the E file because white's king will reach the key square G6. And he explains that King E1, taking the distant opposition with E1, leads only to a draw. The opposition on the E file is meaningless because he has King E8. king e2. And of course, you can return and have a repetition if that makes you happy. King e7, king e3, king e8, again, king e4, king e7. And white cannot get any closer because the e5 square is off limits. Okay. This being, of course, the e5 square. It's covered by the pawns, so you can't really gain the opposition going that way, and black will stymie you all the way on the f, g, and h. So the real question is, how do we avoid that? So he says king e1, king e8, and if the white king leaves the e file, for example, king f2, then again we have king f8, king g3, king g7, king f3, king f7, and as you can see, he has that infamous distant opposition. If you get closer, black will do the same and block you off. And you won't be able to do anything because of that e5 square. Okay, so how do we avoid all of this? King g2 is the winning move. Having understood now that king e2 and so forth doesn't do anything, what does do something? And now king f6. As we have already noted, on the f file, it is necessary to maintain the opposition. Therefore, distant opposition, king f2, king e7. Moving the king forward is useless. For example, if you were to try king f5, king f3, king e5, king e3, king f5, king d4, followed by c5. Yeah. And then, of course, the king will flank him on the other side and help push the pawn forward. Black can't come because suddenly this square here is off limits. So black is in trouble. That's the key to this particular element. So instead of that, since king e5 is useless, he draws back to king e7, hoping to have white make a similar mistake, but he doesn't. Now we have king g3, king f7, king f3, distant opposition, king e7, king g4, king f8, trying to maintain the distant opposition, king f4, king e7, king g5, king f7, king f5. And the distant opposition has now been successfully transformed into the close opposition, and therefore wins. Huh. Fascinating. Sure, glad I decided to refresh this because, yeah, I don't think that I would have remembered all of that. The concept, I mean, how it's executed. Nice, really nice. Now, there may be complaints about the difficulty of his exercises, but the clarity of his lessons is indisputable. Okay, next one. Okay, so whites to play and win. This is not an exercise. This is another part of the lesson. And if you want to try to solve it, go for it. But again, as mentioned multiple times by now, I have the solution in front of me. And yeah, so this is a study by Franz Sackmann, 1913. The first thing white must do is seize the opposition. Therefore, he plays, drumroll, this is spectacular, king f5. And the funny thing is that when you look at it for more than a few seconds, this completely counterintuitive move the king away is quickly understood. So his lessons on the distant opposition are actually very helpful here. And let me explain why, just so it's completely obvious to you as well, if it wasn't immediately so. Because when you look at it like, move the king away, I would never see that. You might. You understand that right here, okay, black, in a sense, has the distant opposition. So how does that work? Well, let's suppose the white king moves up here. Well, black do the same. So we're maintaining that so-called distant opposition. Okay. And if you were to come over here, because of course this is not possible because of the pawn, then black comes over here and we have the close opposition. So in either case, moving to one of the two squares that are either the same distance or closer is immediately obviously not going to help. Close opposition, distant opposition, you ain't getting it by moving up to either e6 or d6. Okay. But black doesn't have any options. Black only has these two squares to move to. The pawns are all blocked, and this square is blocked by the white pawn. So nothing's happening there. So what do? You play instead king f5 because black doesn't have any options. So now black's king must be the first one to move on to the 6th rank. If it had been on a7 in the starting position, in this position, then king b7 would actually work. And he shows, yeah, we'll go into that in a minute. So king b6, king f6, distant opposition. And the rest is standard technique of converting distant opposition into close opposition. And here the major line is the 7th rank. So king b7, king f7, king b6, king a8, outflanking. Don't forget, distant opposition, your goal is to outflank them, not just to sit there trying to get closer. You're going to use that distant opposition to go around them. King a7, king e7, king a8, king d6. And yeah, king b7, and attention, be careful. Sorry, that was Portuguese. King d7. Now, it's worth pointing out, he says, that let's say, the very tempting king takes c5 isn't actually wrong. It's just harder. So he's fair about that. He says, look, after king takes c5, king c7, king b4, king b6, c5 check, and then you're going to have to do this whole roundabout going around kind of situation, but it will win. But and yes, king, by the way, the risk is that you could play something like king takes a4, c5, and suddenly you cannot win this. King b3, king a5, king b3, king c4, king a5, king a5, 3, king a5, etc. You can't get around, and you don't have time to do it around because if you go around, it just fail. Okay, so instead, it's much easier if in this position you just understand that this works. King b6, outflank. King c8, going around, the final decisive outflanking. That is how we win it. The easiest and most efficient way. Nice. So Dvoretsky is, if anything, very insistent and clear about how you exploit the distant opposition. It's not just about keeping, let's say, the whole number of squares and I've got it and so forth. It's converting it into a close opposition, but it doesn't involve, let's say, just going closer because that may not necessarily be possible. Instead, your idea is to use that distant opposition and outflank them, go around one way or the other, and force the weaker side, the side that's failing to hold that distant opposition, into a lost position. Okay. So one last one, and I'll wrap up the lesson of the day for myself as well. And then in the next one, we will pursue, there's only a couple of exercises more, a couple of samples more, and then we'll get into the exercises. And I've seen these exercises, but it's been a while. And with the refresher, possibly even with the help of my memory, I'll be able to find the solutions and calculate them, hopefully with a better success rate than my previous one. Last one for the session. This is actually an excerpt from the game between Frederick Yates and Saviele Tartakover, famous grandmaster. And apparently, black, and obviously you're wondering, well, how is this an opposition? And the reason is that black actually screwed this up. He had a one position and he entered into a pawn endgame, which he thought was winning, and miscalculated. So it's at worst a warning on to the importance of these lessons and how carefully you should be about transposing to something that you think is one and may have some subtleties that you overlooked. So the key move, of course, was played immediately. Queen takes b4, double question mark. And he goes on to say, okay, so pawn takes, a takes b3, king b2, king c4. And king a3, he obviously had seen this. b2. The point being, after king takes b2, king takes b4, draw. Sorry, win, because you have the opposition. So king takes b2, and he doesn't actually show this, but just to be clear. And of course, you have the opposition, easy win for black. Except that that's not what happened. b2, and you say, well, what else can he do? Well, what else can he do? There's only one move that he can do that isn't obviously losing. Actually, there's only one other move that he can do anyway. And he played it, which is a serious oversight by Tartikover, a lack of imagination, I guess. King a2. And black had missed this move when he traded off his queen. He had hoped to win the b4 pawn and seize the opposition, but miscalculated. And now, unfortunately, after king c3, king b1, king takes b4, king takes b2, white has the opposition. And of course, there's really no option because if you don't take it and you play something like, I don't know, king b3, it's an obvious draw. And if black plays king c4, do I need to tell you what the move is? Well, you can do either one, really. You can actually play here, or you can just go back to your a2 and say, drr. So yeah. Well, in any case, it's nice to revisit these positions. It's um, yeah, they're really nice. I mean, honestly, I really like Dvoretsky's choices because they are not only really clear, but like I said, they're pretty, you know. And if you have a sense of aesthetics in chess, these kinds of positions, and sometimes the odd geometries and motifs on the board, then they serve as a motivating factor. You know, what else can he show me that's going to be as mind-bogglingly interesting as well as attractive and appealing? Well, we'll find out soon enough in the next one. And in any case, thank you for joining me here. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you join me for the next one. I will be in the next video. I don't know, either by doing tactics or probably hitting Ludek Pachman directly. One or the other. Regardless, talk to you soon.